Good morning, students, and welcome to what I think is week 2 of Political Sociology. And the topic this week is a big one, and it's becoming even bigger given recent developments, and that is race and politics. And I should say that we could be devoting an entire semester to this topic. I'm not sure I would be able to teach that particular course, but there certainly is enough social science research, historical analysis, political science, history, sociology to produce an entire course. And there are courses taught on race and politics in political science departments. So I had a difficult time deciding what readings to select, and I made some changes, some minor changes this week in terms of the readings, and trying to consider what is the best way to give an overview of this topic, while at the same time thinking about some of the issues that are emerging currently in the U.S. with regard to race. So, let's get started. I'm going to try to use my remote mouse, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Let's see. Okay, so there's a number of angles we can take when we approach the question of race and politics. One of the most obvious and probably central to the idea of political sociology, when we think about the social bases of political behavior, political action, political attitudes, political disposition, one of those social bases would be race and ethnicity. We're going to focus primarily here on race in the American context, black-white, for the purposes of this discussion. So the question is, does one's racial or ethnic status shape their political outlook? Just as we talk about gender shaping somebody's political outlook, or social class, which of course is the most important and central, at least within the context of sociology historically. So that's one big part of thinking about race and politics. The other is how race is used symbolically to motivate and mobilize and create support for candidates, for better or for worse. And in the American context, I would say that has been for the worse. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that has happened. A bigger debate that's taking place, and I think I'll be touching on this in more detail when we talk about identity politics, because it comes up there, and that is the question of race and class and the historical role of race in a capitalist society like the United States. So clearly there is a historical dimension to this, given the history of slavery and discrimination and exclusion and segregation in the United States aimed at black Americans. But this also tends to have certain kinds of political implications when we talk about the best way to think about moving forward with progressive politics. Should the focus be exclusively on race, or should it be on class? And how do these things interact with one another? For those of you who are sociologists, you're familiar with the concept of intersectionality, and essentially that means that there are intersections and interactions between various positions in the stratification system, both the racial as well as the class. And so these things interact with each other in important ways. The political implication would be, for some, what is the best strategy to mobilize a large-scale working class movement? And when you ask that question, that often creates some divisions about whether the focus should be on class or race. And race as one form of identity politics. Again, we'll talk about identity politics in a few weeks. This is one way to talk about the political behavior, the political motivations, the political actions of different groups, particularly within the Democratic Party. And there has been critiques of identity politics largely, probably from the right and the left. The right for different reasons than the critique from the left. And the question is, to what extent is that criticism founded, legitimately founded, based on what's happened in the Democratic Party, and whether the Democratic Party could have pursued a different kind of strategy which might have avoided what is sometimes called identity politics. Now we have identitarian politics as well, and this has broadened our discussion of the idea of identity, which for a while, when people talked about identity politics, they were talking about social movement politics, racial groups, ethnic groups, immigrants, gays, and those kinds of social movements, feminist movements, and viewing all of these as bases of identity that people had, which then galvanized their political action, and which the Democratic Party welcomed in terms of trying to promote opportunity and representation. The question is, has that been a very good strategy? What are the upsides? What are the downsides as well? So this gets into a pretty intense debate among people who are left and liberal, and those are not the same things, in terms of where the priorities should be as we move forward. And for those of you who followed Bernie Sanders' campaign, this became an issue for Bernie Sanders as well. He tried to navigate this, but he certainly had a preference for emphasizing one form of stratification over another. Okay, so let's move on. One way we can think about the role of race in politics is this idea of the Solid South, and then what is called the Southern Strategy. And what's interesting is that for many years after the Civil War, the South was solidly Democratic. The Democratic Party dominated the South. And much of this had to do with the fact that even during the Progressive New Deal, the Democratic Party largely accommodated the wishes of Southern Democrats who wanted to preserve segregation. So even though the Democratic Party was promoting, under the New Deal, a progressive legislative agenda for working people, they did not raise the issue of civil rights, because that would have alienated the coalition, which included a significant segment of the Southern legislators. And they wanted Southern legislators' support for the New Deal, which was aimed at, economic egalitarianism, but not necessarily racial civil rights. So that's an interesting dynamic. There's been a lot written about that, the extent to which the New Deal was or was not sufficiently progressive and successful. That's another argument. Right. Now, in 1964, under Lyndon Baines Johnson, that's LBJ, and remember, Lyndon Baines Johnson was from Texas. He was from a southern state, a state that had a long history of oppression and segregation of black Americans. And when he became president after the assassination of Kennedy, and after he was reelected in 1964, in a landslide win over Barry Goldwater, for those of you who follow the history of presidential races. And one of the acts that LBJ put in place, and LBJ has an interesting history, because on the one hand, he was vilified for the way he conducted the Vietnam War, and that ultimately led to his decision not to seek a second term in 1968. but he had a very progressive domestic agenda, what was called the Great Society, and he put in place lots of what we would probably describe as relatively progressive domestic policies. One of the most significant, one of the most important by far, was the Civil Rights Act 64, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And what LBJ said after he successfully got this passed through Congress is he said, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." That was a very prescient comment on the part of LBJ, because in fact that is what happened. The Democratic Party became the party associated with voting rights, civil rights, addressing the issue of racial disenfranchisement and inclusion or exclusion, and therefore that alienated the South, and LBJ said, we're going to lose the South. The Democratic Party is now associated with an issue, race, which obviously galvanizes Southern voters, Southern politicians, and in fact, we know now that what was once the Solid South Democratic is now the Solid South Republican. Very interesting development. And that has been the case basically since the late 1960s to the present. And there may be some cracks in that solid Republican South, some of which we're seeing in the current election season. I mentioned the role of Goldwater because Goldwater, to some extent, solidified the position of the Republican Party. Goldwater was the most conservative Republican that had ever run. He was viewed as an extremist candidate. That may be one reason why he did so poorly in the 1964 election, which LBJ Johnson won in a landslide. But that began to create an association between the Republican Party and opposition to civil rights in the expansion of those rights and voting rights to all Americans. So the conservatism of the Republican Party really began to be formed during this Goldwater period. Even though Goldwater didn't do well, it was the beginning. It built the foundations. And there has been much written about this moment in American politics and how many people ignore this Goldwater's candidacy as the beginning of the conservative movement. And of course, then it was totally put into place fully by Ronald Reagan. If you're interested in reading this kind of history, I would recommend the books by Rick Perlstein, who's a historian. He just wrote a book called Reaganland. He wrote a book called Nixonland. He has multiple historical accounts of American politics, and he emphasizes the importance of this Goldwater moment. Okay, so the Southern strategy, which I mentioned before, was adopted by Richard Nixon in 1968. Remember that even though the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, was supported by the Democrats, the South was still largely a Democratic stronghold. It takes time for the transition of a region to shift from one to the other. And the Southern strategy for Richard Nixon was essentially to use certain kinds of rhetoric and language, what we call the dog whistle, okay? And hopefully everyone understands what the dog whistle is. It's simply a term, a phrase, a rhetorical device which isn't explicitly racially contextualized or racist, but which conjures up racial images which communicate to voters where you stand on the race issue. And so Nixon deliberately appealed to the disaffected white voters in the South, many of them upset with the progress that blacks were making, and also disaffected from the Democratic Party, which they began to reject as a result of the Civil and Voting Rights Act. The classic dog whistle phrase is law and order. And law and order usually means using the arm of the state, the arm of the police, to manage and control marginalized populations, and in this case, black populations, black urban populations. There were periods during this time, during the 60s, late 60s into the 70s, when there were a number of urban riots, uprising, and so this idea of law and order was explicitly designed to mobilize white voters who had resentment and who had various attitudes, dispositions, which were racist. So this is a quote from Richard Nixon. There are some great quotes because we have all kinds of transcripts now from his conversations. Yep, this hits it right in the nose. It's all about law and order and the damn Negro Puerto Rican groups out there. So this was an explicit policy by Richard Nixon, and it became a fundamental aspect of Republican politics. By the way, I would not confine dog whistle statements entirely to the Republican Party because the Democratic Party has used them as well. Okay. Probably the most notorious quote on the dog whistle issue is this one here. Lee Atwater was a Republican campaign consultant. He worked on a number of campaigns. I think this was maybe when he was working on the Bush campaign, the first Bush campaign. That was Ronald Reagan had 2 terms. His vice president, George H. Bush, not W, had a 4-year term after Reagan, and Atwater worked for, I think, that campaign. I think this is when the statement was made, and you can read it yourself. And basically, he's saying that at one time, you could use the N-word. That was acceptable. You could use it in the South. You could use it to mobilize white disaffected voters to support your campaign. But over time, you have to start using different kinds of language. So you talk about cutting taxes, because presumably taxes are being used to support programs which benefit particular groups. You understand what I'm talking about. You start talking about welfare, right? And so busing, he mentions busing, which is not something that's discussed much now. This was a major issue in the 1970s, where they were trying to desegregate schools. So your opposition to busing was essentially a form of communicating to white voters that you did not appreciate the encroachment of blacks into white communities, or in fact any kind of major government effort to integrate schools. And this has come back to haunt Joe Biden, who during his political career took a very strong stand against busing, and clearly he was doing that to mobilize support for his candidacy when he was running for office back in the 70s. Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater is no longer alive. He, I think, got cancer at some point. There's a story about Lee Atwater on his deathbed, or right prior to his passing away, where he had some remorse about the role he played in Republican campaigns. But clearly he was one of the major Republican operatives, as they call them, that promoted the dog whistle approach. These are just a few of the dog whistles that come up occasionally. Some of them are new or recent, and some are long-standing. Law and order is one. Another is middle-class values, and I've actually heard this in a Joe Biden campaign ad on television. And the idea of middle-class values has often been associated with white values and white suburban life. So when you talk about middle-class values, it does have a racial message. I don't think many people appreciate that, but if you study the way it's been used, particularly when we talk about issues of poverty, for example, like, how can certain groups move themselves out of the ranks of the poor and the poverty-stricken. People often say we have to adopt middle-class values, and that usually means white values. Thug, the term thug, is often used. That has a racial connotation. Welfare queen. That term was used by Reagan as a way to turn Americans against support for the welfare system, and it obviously conjured up a certain image. The idea of inner city issues, inner city problems. Super predator was the term that you may have heard recently, because that was one that was used by Hillary Clinton, I think the Clinton administration. It's related to a particular criminal justice theory about certain kinds of individuals who tend to have extremely violent tendencies, and this was clearly associated with inner city black youth. The suburbs, this has been brought up recently. Donald Trump has talked about how the Democratic Party will enact policies which will encourage certain groups to move into the suburbs, or that the riots are coming to the suburbs. And the idea is the rioters are one group, black, and the suburbs are white. And so this is literally an invasion. Tough on crime, that's another one. When you say you're tough on crime, that doesn't usually mean that you're going to enforce the legal requirements for Wall Street firms. It usually means that you're going to invest in police actions, budgets to enforce and control urban populations. Okay. Monkey this up. That was in the DeSantis-Gillum race for governor of Florida. And when Gillum won the nomination, DeSantis said, well, we don't want him to monkey. He said the economy of Florida is doing so well, we don't want him to monkey this up. And of course, that's the kind of term that conjures up clearly certain kinds of racist tropes. Articulate, to describe somebody as articulate, is to make some judgment about what would normally be the case, but this person happens to be articulate. I put bad hombres in there because that's one that Trump has been using, and that's aimed primarily at Mexicans and Hispanics. Okay, so this is just the short list, but it gives you some idea. And the point is that this terminology is symbolic. It sends a message. It communicates to the voters where you stand. And if you want to attract a particular constituency that has issues on the question of race, this is the way you do it without actually saying the word. Now, some people say, historically we've had dog whistles, and under Trump we have, dog bullhorns, right? So he has taken it to a new level. He is much less restrained. And as a result, you can see the kinds of organizations and groups that have actually supported him because of his candid and explicit statement on issues of race and immigration, xenophobic statements. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the difference in voting patterns by race, and here you can see that Trump won 58% of the white vote, only got 8% of the black vote, right? This is a huge, huge difference. I mean, when we look at percentage differences among various categories, social categories, this is very significant. So obviously, race and ethnicity is a very, very powerful predictor. So when we talk about the social bases of politics, this is just one stark illustration. And here you have white men and white women. There's a gender gap. We can talk a little bit more about that when we talk about gender in politics. Women tend to be less conservative than men and less likely to support the Republican Party. That's what we mean by the gender gap. Trump has probably accentuated that gender gap even more, and we'll see in the 2020 election, but that's probably not a terribly controversial or risky prediction to make, given what we know about where the electorate stands right now with regard to Trump. You can see black women strongly support the Democratic Party. Black men, not so much. There's that gender gap even among racial groups, but it's usually not as great within racial groups outside of whites, because there tends to be a common understanding, whereas within the white population, it's a sharper gender gap. Okay, let's see, where did I go here? Race, okay, it's going the wrong way. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Education, we can talk more about this, but education has become one of the single most powerful predictors, I think, after race, in terms of the way people vote and their party identification. Education comes in second. And we'll talk a little more about that with regard to the relationship between class and the political parties. We have mentioned this before, that to a large extent, at one time, those who had the lowest levels of education supported the Republicans. Those who had the highest level of education supported, those who had the lowest level of education supported the Democrats. Those who had the highest level of education supported the Republicans. This is totally reversed over the last 30 or 40 years, and I think much of it can be accounted for by the fact that the two parties are not terribly different when it comes to the neoliberal political economic agenda, but one area where they are significantly different is on the cultural and social issues. And on cultural and social issues, the higher the level of education, the more liberal you are. So when we talked about earlier in the semester progressive neoliberalism, what that means is progressive on social and cultural policies, neoliberalism relatively conservative on the economics. And so if the Democratic Party practices progressive neoliberalism, they will attract those who have higher levels of education and are much more tolerant, open-minded, liberal on social issues. What would happen if only whites voted? This gives you some idea of the nature of the racial divide in American politics, at least as it pertains to voting in presidential elections. So if just whites voted, you would not have had a Democratic president since at least the 1970s. So you see Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter won that election, but Gerald Ford got the majority of the white vote. Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter badly, so that was a Republican win. Majority voted for Reagan first time, majority voted for Reagan the second time. You had the majority voting for Bush, so those are three terms of Republican rule. Reagan first term, Reagan second term, and Bush only one term. And then you can see that Bill Clinton beat Bush 1992, but a plurality, because we had Ross Perot, I think, in that he pulled a lot of votes. So still, the plurality of the white voters went for Bush. Then you had Clinton running against Dole for his second term, Bill Clinton's second term. And again, I think Perot was involved in that race, and a plurality of white voters voted for Dole. And then you have W getting the majority of white votes, and McCain as well, and Mitt Romney, and of course we know Donald Trump got a majority of the white vote. So this gives you some idea of the importance or the difference it makes when you have black voters involved, participating, enfranchised, not having their voting rights repressed. We talked earlier in the semester about this coalition of the ascendant. That's the prediction that Roy Teixeira and his co-authors, his researchers, the the coming Democratic majority, have argued probably for 20 years. It hasn't quite come to fruition, but the point is that Black and Hispanic and Asian voters lean Democratic, and as the percentage of the voting public becomes more non-white, the prospects for Democratic victories increase. And so that's kind of the demographic prediction for long-term party affiliation. And I had made some critical comments about that prediction in an earlier lecture. One of the problems with this is sometimes the Democratic Party doesn't think it has to do anything. It just has to wait and assume that certain individuals, based on their ascribed characteristics, are somehow going to automatically be attracted to the Democratic Party, rather than actually mobilizing a large, multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic movement based on policy proposals. That's what the Democratic Party should be doing, if they were asking me, if I was a Democratic. And so, by the way, they haven't asked me, okay? They haven't come and said, Jaffee, you have the secret strategy. But they will learn over time. Now, Trump is doing a lot of work for them in the 2020 election, so it makes it a lot easier for them to simply sit back and watch him self-destruct. All right, this is another way to think about the coalition of the ascendant, and you can see that most of the growth in the electorate, as the headline indicates, since 2000 has come from this Hispanic, Black, Asian, we'll say non-white segment of the population. And this bodes well, potentially, at least according to some Democratic consultants, for the Democratic Party's long-term prospects. This is also, you should know, one reason why you might mobilize white voters, or at least some white voters, because if white voters of a particular political ideological persuasion believe that their dominance is being threatened, that they are being replaced, they will get energized and they will get mobilized. And this has definitely happened, and Trump has taken advantage of that politically. In terms of turnout, you see that white and black turnout is not terribly different. You see the Hispanic, Asian is significantly lower. So one of the points I had made in an earlier lecture about the coalition of the ascendant is it does make a series of assumptions. One is that these groups that are becoming a larger proportion of the American population will actually participate at high levels. They won't be alienated or disaffected from the party system. And also that anyone has one drop of non-white blood, so to speak, that's the one drop rule, will automatically identify themselves as a member of the non-white emerging majority. And there's a lot of survey data to show that that's not necessarily the case. So there's a number of assumptions that go into this coalition of ascendant theory or strategy, kind of a do-nothing strategy that can be called into question. Okay, perceptions on race relations. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? This is 2019. By the way, if you're interested in looking at data that's collected, up-to-date data, because we have the General Social Survey, but the General Social Survey is done every 2 years. And what you often want to do is to see, what are the opinions, what are the attitudes, what are the perceptions of Americans on a variety of issues today, or recently, or within the last few months. One of the best places to go is to the Pew Research Center. They're constantly running surveys. This one was done in 2019. And it shows that a solid majority say, a majority say that the situation in terms of race relations is getting worse. And among those who say race relations are generally bad, they are particularly prone to indicating that things are getting worse, whereas people who say, well, things are generally good, they're less likely to say so. So that's kind of obvious. Now, just because you're saying that race relations are getting worse doesn't necessarily mean that you will be promoting or advocating for or supporting more inclusive, progressive policies. You might view race relations as getting worse and think something has to be done about it. What do you mean by race relations? So when you interpret these survey results, you need to try to think about what are people thinking in their mind, in their head, cognitively, when they think of the idea of race relations, and to what extent might that produce one kind of political orientation versus another. Now, we can get these data sets, and I use these data sets in my data analysis class. I'm going to show you some analysis I did recently. So you could look at that. You could say, well, let's for those people who say it's getting worse, what do they say about promoting certain kinds of policies, right? And it could be that people who think it's getting worse think it's getting worse because we have been too tolerant, we've been too inclusive, and that would lead to obviously regressive policy preferences rather than progressive. Black-white differences explaining racial inequality. This is something that has been examined for many, many years, looking at how is it that individuals generally, and black versus whites in particular, understand and attribute the gap in racial income, the income gap between blacks and whites, the wealth gap between blacks and whites. What's the source of this gap? Is it racial discrimination? Well, you can see that blacks are much more likely to believe it is than whites, and they're probably in a better position to know. Less access to high-paying jobs. Again, these are economic factors. Less access to good schools. Again, black respondents identify that in larger numbers than the white respondents. And notice how this shifts when you start looking at these other kinds of factors that tend to be those cited by more conservatives. Well, it's the family structure. You got to do something about the family structure, right? Or you need good role models. If you just had good role models that could teach you middle-class values. And of course, a lack of motivation to work hard. That is becoming less and less cited by both blacks and whites. But at one time, that was part of a kind of culture of poverty, culture of inequality approach. But that has become less and less sustainable given what we know about the way income and wealth is distributed. In terms of racially disparate treatment, you can see, and this is the percent of whites and blacks, saying in generally our country these days, in our country these days, blacks are treated less fairly than whites in each of the following situations, and the black population is much more likely than the whites to indicate that they are treated less fairly. Okay, and you can see that here in dealing with the police. The blacks 84% versus 63%, and of course that this was done in 2019. So if we did this in 2020, I think we would see maybe a sharper difference, or maybe there would be maybe the white percentage would actually increase. That would be interesting to see, and I think the Pew Center has probably done some surveys recently on the Black Lives Matter criminal justice system that probably would be impacted as well. So again, the nice thing about the Pew Research Center is that there are major events that take place, and we want to gauge the effect of those in the short term to see how it moves public opinion. So you can examine this, but you can see that there are sharp differences. And the question is, we know the experience, the lived experience of people based on their social position, social class, a racial position obviously shapes their experiences, their life experiences, and then these in turn shape their perceptions about various political issues, and in turn how they will engage politically. This is support for the Affordable Care Act, and you can see sharp differences there as well. Pretty steady across income categories, but blacks much more likely than whites. So you think about these different kinds of policy proposals that are being made, which would involve greater government support, and you see much greater support among the black population than among the white population. Probably not a surprise. This is an interesting chart. I just threw it in here. I had it from a previous presentation, and it shows essentially who gains and who loses, so to speak. Are the Republicans gaining or are the Democrats gaining based on the change in the percentage of immigrants, foreign-born citizens in the states, and you can see the relationship between that. So as more foreign-born citizens move into states, you see that there is developed this kind of racial ethnic tension that takes place, and in some states this translates into or gives an opportunity for the Republican Party to capitalize and to take advantage of this resentment that might occur as a result of the change in the ethnic composition of the state. Notice way up there in the top right is Arizona, and that's an interesting case because right now, currently, as we move into, I'm speaking now as we're moving into the 2020 election, there is a lot of discussion about Arizona potentially not being a red state, but a purple state, or potentially even going Democratic. This would be a major shift for that particular state, but it's due to the fact that there are increasing numbers of Hispanic citizens in that state as members of the population, and someone told me recently that there has been a large migration, and this is internal migration within the United States, of California residents moving to Arizona. This is something we don't often think about. What is the impact of people moving from one region to another and maybe bringing with them a different political complexion? And so California residents tend to be much more liberal, and if you have a large number of California residents moving to Arizona, that can also shape the political dynamics of that state. Since we are in Florida, people have often talked about how the impact of migrants from the Northeast and the Midwest have shaped the politics of Florida. And if you go to South Florida, you know that South Florida is populated by a large percentage of the population is migrants from the Northeast. They tend to be more liberal, and South Florida is in fact a liberal bastion within the state. So that's another interesting dynamic. Okay, so I did some analysis yesterday. I pulled up the most recent Pew data set, which is available. You can analyze it yourself. It comes as an SPSS data set. And so I was just looking at a number of questions they asked people to see what kinds of differences exist between race and Hispanic categories. So this question basically is about the responsibility of the government, and you can think about that broadly. You know, does the government have a bigger role to play in assuring that people are protected from economic hardships? In this case, the specific item is health care coverage, and you can see the question, do you think it is a responsibility of the federal government to make sure all Americans have health care coverage? Now, this isn't necessarily Medicare for all, but that they have health care coverage in one form or another. And you can see, and let's just look at the difference between the white and the black. The percentage of whites saying yes, it is the responsibility of government, 55%. Blacks, basically 85%. It's a huge percentage difference. And you can see that Hispanics are also more likely than whites, and a majority of Hispanics also believe that the government has the responsibility to provide health care. So I'm just trying to show how the racial, and in this case, because I have some ethnic categories, Hispanic, shape people's views on significant social and political and economic issues. Should tax rates on large businesses and corporations be raised? Okay, 40% of whites say it should be raised a lot, versus 56.3% of blacks. So you see blacks and Hispanics as well more likely to support what I would call a more progressive tax system, something that we talked about last week. Do you think abortion should be available generally? I think this is an open-ended question, not under certain conditions, but if somebody desires to have an abortion, should it be legal? Legal in all cases, legal in most cases, and you can see that the differences are quite significant. And if you add the legal in all cases and legal in most cases, you can see that for whites, it's about, let's see, 3, 4, 5, about 62%, and for blacks, it's about 77%. Okay, 77%. So significant differences there. And notice the Hispanic population tends to be less supportive of this, and you might have a explanation for this, a plausible explanation for why Hispanics are less likely, and this may have something to do with traditional religious values that would be worth investigating. So again, on the abortion issue, you can see where people stand. Corporations have too much power or too little power. So I've identified the too much power. And here's an area where you see essentially universal across the racial categories, across the racial ethnic categories, agreement. Corporations have too much power. Now, if I'm a Democratic consultant, I would say you need to emphasize these kinds of issues because there's a clear majority of Americans who believe corporations exercise far too much power in our society, and you can use that to mobilize. Now, to use that to mobilize means that you identify corporations as the enemy, okay? As the elite, as the powerful, that is exercising power over the majority. Now, people describe this as populism, right? Mobilizing the population in directing that mobilization against a particular group, a particular target. In this case, we're talking about class, okay? We're talking about the capitalist class, the corporate elite versus the vast majority. One of the problems, of course, if I advised the Democratic Party to sort of promote this idea, is they say, well, you're promoting class warfare. And here's something else they would probably say. We don't want to alienate our donors, our corporate donors, by mobilizing the population around the fact that those corporations have too much power. So you often ask yourself, why don't Democrats do this? Because they probably would gain support in elections if they promoted these issues. Okay, so in terms of practical politics, it makes sense. But then you have to look at the class composition of those who ultimately have the greatest power and control, the donor class of the Democratic Party. So on the one hand, yeah, it would make sense politically. On the other hand, well, The problem is the party is largely dominated, controlled, maybe not as much as the Republican Party, but still, nonetheless, controlled, dependent upon the donor class, which is the corporate class, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, large corporate firms. But you can see this is not an issue that would divide blacks and whites. You could have a multi-racial, multi-ethnic coalition supporting progressive policy to rein in the power of corporations. Corporations make too much profit. Okay? Closely related to the other one. Check it out. Majorities, white, black, Hispanic, other, support this. Okay? Believe they do make too much profit. It's a great way to mobilize, again, multiracial, multi-ethnic movement in progressive directions for progressive, significant progressive taxation. Now, the proposals typically from the Democrats are, well, the Republicans have gone too far. We're not going to let them go any further, right? It's always the fortress liberalism. We're not going to let them go any further, or we're going to maybe roll back where they were before. But, of course, where the tax rates were before was not much better than where they are now, given that we've had 40 years of neoliberalism. Do you plan to vote for Trump? Okay. Now, this was before they knew the Democratic nominee when this survey was taken. And you can see there's obviously some sharp differences here. 27.9% say definitely, of whites, definitely voting for Trump. Let's say 28%. And then you've got another 11% probably, and that's, a good reflection of his core constituency. It's right around 35 to 40% of the electorate currently in terms of his support, hardcore support. Some of that is dwindling as he continues to act in utterly regressive, reactionary, authoritarian ways. That even are alienating some of his hardcore, former hardcore supporters, or maybe some supporters who were on his side or would have voted for him based on their partisan attachment as Republicans, maybe not so much hardcore support for him as an individual. And you can see 18% for Hispanics, okay, so for the black population. Sorry, no way. I'm voting for Trump. Definitely voting for the Democratic candidate. Remember, the Democratic candidate isn't known at this time. And you can see that a 63% black versus 40%, roughly 40% white. Right, so big differences there. Okay, I hope that you derive something from the readings. And I would just highlight a few items that are discussed in the readings, and I hope you will pay attention to them because I think they're important. The whole relationship between race and party identification historically and party realignment, and the way whites and blacks have shifted between the Democratic and the Republican Party, largely based on particular policies, issues, legislation, as we said, like the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act is one example. There was one time historically when the majority of blacks were aligned with the Republican Party. That's when the Democratic Party was largely associated with the Southern segregationists. And the Republican Party was associated with the party of Lincoln, right? So that's an interesting historical dynamic that you should take a look at. Weaponizing race for political gain. We've already made some references to that with dog whistles and how that is being done currently. There's a discussion in the Baltz piece about Obama and the backlash, or what some people call it the white lash, and that is how people interpreted his 8 years in office and the Tea Party movement that resulted as well. These are fundamental dynamics. I mean, the point of the first reading is essentially there's no way you can understand American politics if you don't introduce the role of race, right? And these cultural chauvinistic appeals that are made historically in the United States. We have a long history of this sort of thing. So even though Trump has brought a lot of it out of the woodwork, you need to understand it's always existed, it's always been there. He didn't invent it. He's exploiting it. And he has been doing a very effective job of exploiting it. And by the way, the Republicans haven't, the party hasn't said much, because what do they have to offer the majority of the population? Are they going to talk about the corporate welfare that they promote? No, people don't want to hear about that. They're going to talk about the country club life that they... No, because the majority of people would probably not really get too excited about that aspect of the Republican Party. So we know that this has been a long-term strategy of the Republican Party. But the Democratic Party is not above it as well. And that's important to note. The piece by Johnson, I wanted you to see, because we have the emergence, the re-emergence, I think, based on the police murders of black men, largely. The Black Lives Matter movement has been resurgent. We've had protests across the country. The question is, what does it mean? How do we interpret this? How do we translate those movements into political gain, political action? And Johnson is not necessarily supporting this idea that we need to focus on anti-racism. So he's making a kind of subtle argument. And one of the points that he makes, and you can find some of his other articles. I think I have another one of his longer pieces if you're really interested in understanding where he's coming from, because some people might say, well, he doesn't really support this anti-racist thrust. Well, he doesn't support that because he has a bigger political agenda, okay, a broader political agenda. And he worries that the focus on anti-racism is something that can be too easily accommodated, appropriated, and adopted by the elites, by corporations, who are more than happy to say, yes, I'm not a racist, yes, Black Lives Matter, and they can, it's called woke washing, if you haven't heard that term. Greenwashing is a term that's been around for a while, and that is when corporations give people the impression that they're environmentally responsible, by doing things symbolically, right? But ultimately they're destroying the environment by their day-to-day actions. And of course the same thing now, where we have woke washing, that is expressions of being woke, usually by deference to and genuflecting to the Black Lives Matter motto, is often sufficient, right? And his point is that ain't going to do it, because he has a broader, really a more radical political economic agenda in mind. And this has created, again, some debate on the left on what is, we'll call artificial progress, where people say, yeah, Black Lives Matter. We should be more inclusive. Diversity is important, that kind of stuff. And those who say we have to fundamentally restructure the political economic organization of the society. We have to defund the police. You can't run away from that. We have to defund the police, rethink policing, understand the nature of social control. These are bigger issues. And I've talked about this in my podcast, because cancel culture, what's called cancel culture, hopefully you're aware of that. A lot of the cancel culture has been aimed at people who do not sufficiently express their level of wokeness. And because of that, they individually are attacked. That's not a very effective political strategy, and it certainly doesn't get you very far, because if these racial injustice issues are systemic or structural, getting individuals to change their view or the way they talk is not in any way getting at the fundamental source of the problem. So I'm very sympathetic to Johnson's work. I also have an article there by Adolph Reed, which I will mention when we talk about identity politics. These are two individuals who have been critical of the way in which the black political movement has taken shape because of the political implications. It's important to understand that. They understand the opposition, they understand the protests, they support them, but the question is, how do we then translate this movement into some real, fundamental, structural, systemic political change? Okay, racial resentment is also discussed in the piece by Edsel, and his analysis of racial attitudes as a partisan predictor. Okay, so you got the, I think it's Bolt's piece. You've got Johnson and you've got Edsel. These are all very good readings that will further elaborate on some of the things I've touched on. So with that, I will sign off. Be well, stay strong, and any questions, issues, want to have a discussion, conversation, check out the office hours or contact me, and I'll be happy to arrange something that works for both of us in terms of day and time. All right, let's see if I can sign off.